So the question is, who's in mastery of who? That's the question. Regarding the Russia to whom there is good. So most of the time, the evil in him, the animal soul in him, is in mastery of his entire self, rather than the opposite. Now, that's an important point here, this line that says so. But when the evil, or when the animal soul takes charge, goes in the driver's seat of the incomplete Russia, the incomplete wicked person to whom there is still some good, then because of that good that is still left in the Russia, he still feels bad about it. Even during the sin, he feels bad about it. He feels bad. He knows that he's sinning, but he just can't control himself because, again, the animal soul is in the driver's seat. He just becomes a spineless sheep at that point, but he still recognizes that it's bad. Now, if you recall, last week, we concluded with this thought that in of itself is a worthy trait of the incomplete Russia. Even though, yes, at the end of the day, he still sinned, but just that feeling of, oh, I know I'm doing something wrong, oh, I know I'm not supposed to be doing this, is a feeling that can become the foundation of transformation for that person. We spoke about, and that's really last week, we spoke about this Talmudic statement that fits into the discussion about people who marry their spouses in condition of something. So if a person marries a spouse, we said in condition that he has $1 million in the bank and he doesn't, then the marriage obviously is invalidated. It doesn't take place. Same if a person says, I have brown eyes and he has blue eyes, or whatever it may be. If the condition isn't met, then the marriage is invalid. But the Talmud says that if a person, remember that? If a person says, I'm marrying a spouse in condition that I'm a complete tzaddik, completely righteous, the Talmud continues to say, even though he may be completely wicked, she is still married. They are still married. The marriage is still valid. Now, why is that? Because while he was saying that, while he was giving that condition, he may have had a thought to become a completely righteous person. And that thought in and of itself transformed him at that moment. The transformation didn't last. He didn't continue to capitalize on it. But the thought was still there. And that thought transformed him into a completely righteous. And that's why the marriage is valid. So I'm just saying, just to go back to this part here, that he does so not wholeheartedly and without pleasure, it's still something that's valid, that's very worthy. Even though, again, the incomplete Russia follows through, remember, through the 3 stages that we spoke about, still, that thought is valid. And eventually, when the incomplete Russia does teshuvah, it's really a capitalization, it's a building of that initial foundation that was laid by that thought. Even though, again, the thought wasn't followed through then, but that gave birth, that was a seed, so to speak, to the tree of teshuvah that he eventually can and will build. But that's the idea here. So let's not dismiss this thought. I think it's a very important point. Especially, again, it's no coincidence that we find ourselves here in the month of Elul, which is the month of teshuvah, in which we prepare ourselves for the high holidays. And, what is teshuvah? Teshuvah's first and foremost step is the person saying, you know what, I got to stop this. It might take him time to stop it, right? But that's the foundational step. I have to stop what I've been doing. I have to rectify this. And from then, that person can build on. And that's really what the sentence is all about. The person may be an incomplete Russia, but again, just that thought becomes the foundation to teshuvah. There is just to give you the halachic concept of this, it's called, the way it is called both in the Talmud and many, many other places, this is called a hirur teshuvah, which means a thought of teshuvah. It's not even a thought. A thought is something actually more dominant. Hirur means just a spark of teshuvah, spark of the thought. It's not even the thought itself. But that spark can take fire, can be ignited if a person is brave enough. but you can't start a fire without a spark. So that spark of teshuvah is really what can eventually lead a person to complete teshuvah. And that spark that Russia feels all the time, especially when he's sinning. He feels that all the time. He doesn't have maybe the bravery or the tools to capitalize on it. But nonetheless, it's a spark that is worth noting and worth celebrating. Okay, let's continue. Let's continue. 271. Because, by the way, the reason I'm emphasizing that is also because sometimes you will say to yourself, well, who am I trying to lie? Right? Like there's a parent who came to me not too long ago and said, well, my teenager is living a double life. So what do you mean? Wow, that's a strong term. And they said, no, in school, he's all fine. You know, even at home, he's all fine. But then when he leaves the home and he leaves the school, boy, he becomes a different person. He goes and parties and does this and does that. It's a double life. And I said to myself, first of all, he's a teenager. Where were you when you were 16 and 17? I'm interested to know. But number two, there's no such thing as double life in that context, at least. You have an animal soul and you have a divine soul. And sometimes he follows his animal soul, and sometimes he follows his divine soul, just like you, just like every one of us. So to judge him that he has a double life, and I think is way too harsh, and it's also not helpful for your child. You see him as a double, it's not helpful at all. And then I went on further. I said, I'm sure that even when he, does things that he's not maybe supposed to do, he still doesn't feel good about it. So you are going to make him feel even worse. You're going to build this rabbit hole for him. Actually, you should tell him, you should encourage him that divine soul is what is speaking to him. And it's a sign that he is indeed so divine. And it's a sign that he can and should overcome all of these animalistic inclinations. But everyone has those two inclinations, and depends on what we focus on. So the incomplete Rasha can focus on all the bad that he does, but that further digs that rabbit hole and in a way paralyzes him. Or we can focus on that thought, even though you can say to himself, oh, who am I lying to? I'm actually doing bad. So that thought really doesn't represent. No, that does represent you. That does represent the deepest you, your divinity. And we can focus on that, as that mother should focus on her teenager son, or as we should focus on ourselves. And from there, develop that divinity and eventually allow the divine soul to take place or take over the animal soul. So that's why the focus on this. Okay. Okay, now, please, yes, please.
Oh, I don't mean to interrupt you. No.
No. I was about to say, I don't mean to be the only one speaking here. So please feel free to speak your mind.
Okay. So my understanding, if my understanding is correct, the difference between the complete Rasha and the incomplete Rasha is that the incomplete Rasha has this spark. Am I correct?
All right, exactly.
So on the opposite,
that bothers him even while he is sinning.
Right. And so on the opposite scale, a tzaddik and an incomplete tzaddik. So the incomplete tzaddik would be one who has the spark to do bad.
Right.
Like on the mirror side, you know what I'm saying?
Right. No, so he has a spark of evil. Like we said it. Remember that example we brought, that sleeping dog. So the dog is there. It's a spark, but it never takes fire. It never ever bothers him. In other words, it never changes him in any shape. Doesn't change his actions, doesn't change his speech, doesn't change his thoughts. But it's there. You're right. You can make that parallel. The spark in the Rasha doesn't change him. That's why he's still a Rasha.
Right.
Complete Rasha, but he's still a Rasha. And the spark in the tzaddik of evil doesn't change him. That's why he's still an incomplete tzaddik. But it's still there in either side. Though the Rasha should capitalize on his spark, the incomplete tzaddik shouldn't. I don't think he even knows how to. Right.
I want to make sure I understood correctly.
No, that's a good point. It's a very, very good point. There's a parallel between the two. Benoni is really the one that stands alone, as we'll soon see. By the way,
you don't have to wait.
the complete Russia. What does it mean? A complete Russia? Are they really people that are so numb to goodness that they don't even feel it? So numb to the divine soul that that's it. There's not even a spark there. Is that what a complete Russia is?
There are complete Russias. There are, unfortunately, psychopaths. I mean, people who enjoy doing evil. I mean, and there are.
Right. But even not on that level, I'm reminded of the Talmudic statement that says that the person that sins once, he knows that he's doing it wrong. Twice also, he knows that he's doing something wrong. But then eventually, as the Talmud says, na'aseh lo keheter, it becomes permissible in a person's eyes. The repetition of the sin is really what creates the numbing. Na'aseh lo keheter, because you start rationalizing and rationalizing and rationalizing until it becomes the truth in your eyes. But we'll get to the definition of the complete Russia too later on in the chapter.
Rabbi, I don't think we have to wait till the month of Elul to do tshuva.
Right.
Or Yom Kippur. I think we should do tshuva daily in our lives, not just, let's wait until Elul and then we'll do tshuva and then we'll go back to ourselves and then. But if you continue to do tshuva, eventually you reach higher heights.
Very well said. Very, very well said. And you're right. You're absolutely right. And that's why we dedicate so many parts of the prayer to teshuvah, right? Not just the supplications, but also in our milah 3 times a day. We say, Ashivenu Hashem elecha v'nashuva, or Achazirenu b'tshuva shelema lefanecha. Please make us do teshuvah. We ask God, because indeed it never stops. The act of teshuvah never stops. Now, there is just like a good business, right? A good business doesn't constantly check the books. Otherwise, you'll never have time to do business. You're always in the accounting department. So in the Jewish calendar, we dedicate a whole month to checking our books. So there's immense effort on really analyzing every part of the self and doing that accounting. But it doesn't mean that the 11 months that are left, we shouldn't do teshuvah. We should at least maybe not go into such details, not immerse ourselves in the accounting department, so to speak, but still seek to correct that which needs to be corrected and always return to who we truly are. Because after all, teshuvah is not just rectifying sins, but it's becoming who we truly are. That's why it's called the return to the true self. Very often in life, we deviate from that. So every day, 3 times a day, we say, let us remember who we truly are, the divine being that we truly are. And that's 3 times a day during the prayer. That's when we do teshuvah. Maybe not the full day. On Elul, it might be the full day. By the way, so we have a month dedicated to teshuvah in the Jewish calendar, but beyond that month, we also have a day every week dedicated in a way to teshuvah. And that's the day of Shabbat. That's why the sages teach that the word Shabbat, the name Shabbat, shares actually the same letters as the word teshuvah. Shabbat, Shin Bet Taf, has the same letters as teshuvah, Taf, Shin Bet. And that is because Shabbat, in a way, is a day in which we go in. And we also have to analyze ourselves and ask ourselves, did the 6 days of the week pull us away from ourselves? And if yes, how can we return to that true self? So you're right, absolutely. There are moments dedicated to teshuvah, days every week dedicated to teshuvah, a month that's dedicated to teshuvah, but it doesn't mean that at least 3 times a day we can't think of teshuvah and correct. Do a quick recalibration of what is needed. Yeah, absolutely. I'll share with you just a parable that comes to mind of the Baal Shem Tov. It's a very, very powerful parable, but it's a parable that he would say applies to this month. And that's also why we blow the shofar every day of this month. But it's the parable of the prince who lived in the palace of his parents, the king and the queen. And at one point, even though he had everything he needed in the palace, they both decided that they needed the prince to go and see the world to enrich himself, his mind, and learn about the cultures of the world so that he will know how to be the king of the world, not just of his own little place. He'll be able to understand people of all sorts. So anyway, he's about to leave the palace, but he makes a promise to his parents, to the king and to the queen, that he won't forget who he is. And he won't change his name, and he won't change his behavior, and he won't change his clothes, he won't change his speech, and so on. He leaves the palace, and he goes out to the world, and slowly but surely the world affects it. And he starts losing his name. He has too royal of a name. He needs to assimilate. Then he starts losing his behavior, then his clothes, and he substitutes them with just, simple clothes or whatever it may be. But now it's time to come back. After a few years, it's time to come back to the palace. Comes back to the palace, and he tries to enter the palace as he would do years beforehand. But the guards don't recognize him. So you're a stranger. Strangers are not allowed here. And he tries to explain, I'm the prince. We don't recognize you. Get out of here. He says, okay, there's another entrance. Goes to the other entrance. The same story happens. They kick him out. Now he doesn't know what to do. He can't get into his palace. There's a little forest next to the palace. He says, I guess I'll have to sleep here tonight. And he he finds a tree and puts his possessions down. And then he starts realizing, gosh, I should have kept my promises. And he feels just terrible about it. And he starts to cry. And he cries from the depths of his heart so loudly. The cry reaches the room of the king. The king looks out through the window and he says, I recognize this voice, but I don't recognize the person it's coming from. So he decides to leave the palace with his entourage to go and see who this person is. And he leaves the palace, and the closer he gets to the prince, he recognizes that this is his son. And his son then all of a sudden sees his father, the king, and he begins to weep even more. And he says, Father, I'm so sorry. I didn't keep my promises. But will you forgive me? Will you welcome me back to the palace? And of course, the king, the father, says yes. And they hug, and he's brought back to the palace. And the Baal Shem Tov would say that that story encapsulates the message of Elul and Rosh Hashanah too. But in Elul, we pause. We go to that tree, and we ask ourselves, whoa, have we estranged ourselves from our true selves, from God? And if yes, then we cry, and that's the shofar that we blow every day of the month. And we cry, and we really regret it. But God doesn't become apathetic to that cry, quite the opposite. He wants to go out of his palace. That's why the king is in the field, as we say. God is out to greet us with the shining countenance and with a smile. And he wants to know, who's this person crying? And then he realizes, oh, it's my children. And everyone is like an only child to God. It's my only child. And we say to God, we're so sorry. Yes, we've analyzed this. We've analyzed this. We should have changed our speech, our behavior, our name, etc. And God says, don't worry, I'll forgive you. I'll bring you back to the Rosh Hashanah is when he brings us back to the palace and we crown him. It's the shofar of Rosh Hashanah. We crown him over ourselves as our king again, as Avinu Malkeinu, our father, our king. But that's really, that cry is the cry of the incomplete Rasha. He knows that he's doing something wrong, and there's something crying within him. He's not brave enough, or whatever the reason is, again. He doesn't have the mastery over himself to follow that cry. But at least now, once a year, during the month of Elul, we can cry through the shofar and really analyze ourselves and really take upon ourselves to change. And then the king comes and embraces us and says, please come back to the palace. Of course, I forgive you, you're my son. That's the idea here. Okay, let's continue. Unless, again, please welcome any other comments, questions, disagreements. Okay, let's continue. So these are the thought, speech, middle of the page at 271.
Yeah.
Anyone, please.
These are the thought, speech, and action of Klipa discussed in chapter 6.
Right.
That is either in deed alone, that is deed without the premeditation of thought and discussion, which is the process by which a person comes to identify more deeply with his actions. Furthermore, we are not talking here about severe transgressions. Not only might this be a deed that only superficially relates to the inner self of its doer, but the deed itself might be the most subtle of sins.
Right. A commission.
The commission of minor transgressions and not major ones, God forbid.
Right. So just to clarify here, we're speaking about how the incomplete Rasha sins while still having that thought of regret, but how he sins. So there are three realms, as we study in chapter 6. There are three realms in general to a human being, and that's thought, deed, and action. And he transgressions in all three of those realms, in thought, speech, and action. Now we're analyzing the sin in the deed of the Rasha. What's the sin of the deed? Beyond the actual detail of what that Rasha is doing, that incomplete Rasha is doing, the sin of the deed is that he jumps to the deed without any thought. We're not categorizing what the deed is. That's a different story. The deed might be stealing, it might be whatever, but it's the jumping to the deed without even thinking. It's almost like an animal. You can't control himself. That's why it's called the animal soul, right? Is instinctively going towards the deed without saying, oh, maybe I shouldn't be doing this. That's what we're speaking about. Now, this is true mainly in minor transgressions. In big transgressions, everyone has some thought, oh, we're talking about stealing, I'm about to rob a bank for millions of dollars. Let me really think about this. But if it's like 2 cents, that he jumps to the deed. That the minor transgressions is where we see that uncontrollable instinct jump to the deed without the thought and the speech beforehand. That's where we see the incomplete Rasha fail the most. And why? Because in his eyes, it's just minor. Minor, who cares? Really, will that make a difference? It's true with speech too. I'm just going to say this. I'm just going to respond like this with this insult. I'm just going to speak Lashon Hara for 2 seconds. I'm not saying anything bad. So you jump to the deed without even thinking. And that in of itself is really the main problem of the Rasha. There's no thought, there's no control. There's no asking himself, well, what I'm about to do, is it good? And that again pertains mainly to the minor transgressions. Even though the minor transgressions are really the most important. That's why the ethics of the fathers, ethics of Pirkei Avot says that that we should relate to mitzvah kala kevachamura, to the small mitzvahs like the strict mitzvahs, and same with the sins. Small sins are just as grave as what may seem in our eyes as big sins. Because we do not know how God relates to them. From a divine perspective, what is small might be big, and what is big might be small. So it might be small in our eyes, but in the eyes of God, it's so much bigger. And anyway, so that's why he has much more of a weakness towards minor transgressions, because he doesn't think about that. Let's just read Rabbi Stein's commentary on the minor transgressions. Let's go.
Okay. The minor transgression is not necessarily one that is without effect. On the contrary, the more righteous one is, the more sensitive one becomes to sin. The Talmud tells how the strap of Rav Huna's tefillin once got twisted so that the black side, which should be exposed, was turned inward. To rectify this sin, Rav Huna fasted 40 fasts. This was an extremely minor matter done inadvertently, and from which he certainly derived no physical or spiritual pleasure or gain. Yet to Rav Huna, this minute flaw in the manner of his fulfillment of a mitzvah was nothing less than devastating.
Right. Let's another story here about Rabbi Elimelech of Lizhansk, powerful one. Go ahead. Yeah, one more. Yeah.
Rabbi Elimelech of Lizhansk was one of the great leaders of the third generation of Hasidim. The whole of the Polish branch of Hasidim is traced to him and his disciples. Hasidim would interpret the verse, "A river emerged from Eden to the water the garden," as follows. Eden is the Baal Shem Tov, founder of Hasidism. A river emerged from Eden. This is the Baal Shem Tov's discipline and successor, Rabbi Dov Bear of Mizcharich, to water the garden. This is Rabbi Elimelech.
Right, but that's how saintly he was, this Rabbi Elimelech. But let's go to the story. The author of the
The
Tanya.
author of the Tanya once found himself in the synagogue of Mitnagdim, opposers of Hasidim, when he noticed a book lying under a bench. He picked it up and saw it was a copy of Rabbi Elimelech's work, Noam Elimelech. When asked to describe the author of that book, Rabbi Shner Zalman said, "I'll tell you one thing about him. If you had thrown the author of this book under the bench, he too would have not uttered a word in protest. For despite his greatness, Rabbi Elimelech regarded himself as the lowliest of low. It is told that he would often go into the forest and sit on an anthill until the ants stopped biting him, and he would cry, 'Melech, Melech, see, the ants even no longer want to bite you.' He frequently cried, 'I am the most wicked man in the world.' Once one of his followers said to him, 'Rabbi, whom are you trying to fool? You know that it's not true.' Rabbi Elimelech replied, 'The finer the needle, the more it pierces. Even for the perfect tzaddik, there can be something that he will experience as a sin, and that he can be so slight that someone else might have not been aware of it. But the finer it is, the more piercing it is to the lofty soul.'"
Right. So again, yeah, we're speaking about these minor transgressions. The question is, how do you define minor? And it depends on your level. The higher you are, the holier you are, the more sensitive you are to that which is opposite holiness, to that which stands opposite of holiness, because again, you're holy. So what stands opposite to a holy person might not stand opposite to someone who's not that holy. The holy person is just more sensitive to it, and therefore he or she considers that which stands opposite holiness as really something of grave proportions. So another example I would use, and I've used that example, is that if you go on a diet now for 30 days and you eat healthy and you drink all these juices and you eat kale and broccoli, whatever it may be, and after 30 days you go and have a slice of pizza, your body will probably reject it. You'll probably vomit afterwards. But if you eat pizza every day, after 30 days, you eat another slice of it, nothing will happen. Why? Because your body is not as healthy as that person who just went on a diet for 30 days. The person who went on a diet for 30 days, now he's sensitive to what is good and what is bad for the body. Same, it's true with the body, same with the soul. Person who constantly works on his soul, who's truly holy. So the person will therefore be as sensitive as possible to even the most minute pizzas of the world, soul pizzas of the world, and will reject them. But for a person who doesn't really work on himself, oh, okay, fine. This little detail doesn't matter. That's how. So therefore, minor is really a question of who you are. Based on who you are, you know what is minor and what is not. Now, of course, the goal is to be a tzaddik, or at least a Beinoni. I mean, no one can be unless you're born that way, you can't really be a tzaddik, as the Tanya explains. But if you are really working to become a Beinoni, then you become more and more sensitive to even those minor transgressions. While the incomplete Rasha is not. That's what makes him an incomplete Rasha. And that's why the story of Rabbi Elimelech and the story of Rav Huna. But the point being here, and I think that's really the main point, and we'll end with it, is that even though some transgressions might seem so minor and therefore so unimportant, we should relate to them as major transgressions. First, because I'm sure that in the eyes of the holy people, they are major, right? Because of his sensitivity, and that's really the way we should view life. But secondly, also because of what the ethics of the fathers teaches us, that we don't know. Maybe in the eyes of God, they are major. In our eyes, they may seem minor. In the eyes of God, they are major. And therefore, we should also be very careful. How do you do that? By thinking before you act. That's what the Rasha doesn't do. Think. Don't jump to action. And if you're unsure, then don't do it until you've researched it fully. Now, whatever was done, was done. You did the shuvah, and that's what, when we go back to what we spoke about, and we move forward. You can't live in the past. You can't look back like the wife of Lot that turned into the pillar of salt because she looked back. But on the other hand, moving forward, and that's really the point of Elul, and then month after Elul, is to say to ourselves, okay, we'll make sure that now we think before we act, and even towards these minor transgressions, or it may seem minor in our eyes.